how then do we read the law well? In the light of the story, the developing story of the Old Testament, what would be an appropriate way for us to approach the law? Obviously, there are many laws there that were for that specific place and that specific time for specific reasons. But are you saying that there are values and principles
There's
embedded?
principles. Well, this is why it goes together with culture together. For example, you're not to eat pork or the meat of a pig.
Now, I hope you're going somewhere with this that my wife can be comfortable with. She loves bacon. So, so what do we do
Yeah.
with
Well, this is
what do we do with a law like that?
What do we do with this? But this is where culture fits in. Major work was done on this by Mary Douglas, who's a sociologist. Purity and danger. And the point of that law is to inculcate in Israel, everything has to fit a pure form. That clean meat would be like a thoroughbred horse, a purebred dog. It's the opposite of mixture. And so their diet taught them no mixture. You're a distinct people.
So it becomes a picture of holiness.
That's right. That's what it's about. See, but that's where the culture comes in. We have to understand that a bit, and that's why we have seminars to help pastors to understand these things, so they can interpret it better to the people. But so it's a picture of, or you couldn't sow your field with two kinds of seed. You couldn't wear clothing made of wool and linen. It had to be one or the other. No mixture. Well, obviously, if you have that inculcated in you, no mixture, you're not going to marry a Gentile. You would know my seed is set apart to God for a holy seed. So that's what it's inculcating. But that's why it's very difficult to answer a question like this, because it's such a big subject. Let me just say one more thing. You see, you can go down the highway and it will say, drive carefully. Okay, that's like love God with all your heart. Great, but what does that mean? What does it mean to drive carefully? Well, then you get road signs that tell you 35 miles per hour, yield, stop. You get all the details of what it means to drive carefully. In the same way, love God with all your heart gets broken down into the 10 Commandments. This is what it means to love God with all your heart. This is how you behave. And then you may even, in driving, you have to take a written test. And then you might get into Proverbs, which gives you even more detail, so that, for example, you're told in the Deuteronomy not to commit adultery. But in Proverbs, what do? When the wife comes into the room, who's a virtuous woman, a husband stands up in her honor. Now that's detail. You see, it's wonderful material.
I think of the laws in Leviticus 19, for instance. Very practical. There you have a law that you are not to gather up all the fruit of a vineyard, all of the things that are left on the ground in the field, in order to care for the poor, to provide for the disadvantaged in your culture. And one friend of mine who's a New Testament scholar made the point that in our culture today, if we followed that to the letter, it really wouldn't be very practical to say to the poor among us, go out to this field, this 40-acre plot that's been combined, and see what you can find there. But the principle and the value is you don't use up all your resources to the nth degree, so that you assume that part of your resources that you really don't need are going to go for those who are not advantaged as you are. Is that what we're talking about in terms of taking
here's
the
where
values?
the Hebrew would come in. The Hebrew says it belongs to them. You don't own it. And people think I'm sharing. No, you're not. They're entitled to it.
It's the Lord's.
It's the Lord, and He gave it
And
to
He has given it to them.
He gave it to the poor. They own it. But who thinks that way? An illustration of this, where you have to get to the general equity, what's behind the principles of this kind of a law. We're reading through Deuteronomy of putting a parapet around your house. So I said to the kids, well, there it says put this railing around your house. Should we put a railing around our roof? Now, we lived in Vancouver, where it rains a lot. And we don't have flat roofs for the most part. You have steep roofs for snow to come off and rain to come off, and nobody goes on the roof. So I said, they said, yeah, we should. I said, well, think about it. What good would putting a railing around there as nobody's up there, and so forth. And they realized the point, that this is a different culture. So I said, well, what does it mean? And I was surprised. My 9-year-old boy said to me, Dad, that means we ought to have good brakes on our car. Somehow he was able to go from the specific of the principle, get the principle, and make the application today. How the mind does that, I really don't know that altogether. And that's the tricky part of it, is applying the law. But that's where the pastor comes into the equation too.
So the point is, we need to do things to ensure the safety of those who are around us in the world and in the culture. Right. We need to be responsible with our resources, our things, in order to protect others. So when we have a principle, a value that says we are to be concerned about how our decisions and using our resources affects others, really points back to Leviticus 19:18, that you're to love your neighbor as yourself.
That again is like loving God with all your heart. What does it mean to love God? Well, it's a certain behavior. Love your neighbor as yourself. The rest of the law defines what it means to love your neighbor. But that's a very interesting verse, Leviticus 19:18. We all know that. But you said it's all the word of God earlier. Leviticus 19:17 says, rebuke your neighbor frankly, or you will be complicit in his wrong. Now, how many of us have the courage in love to correct a neighbor? One of the troubles I have in life, there are few people who will correct me. I desperately need it. But we're afraid to, because I think rightly so, we know our own depravity. It's very hard to have a critic, you see something wrong without having a critical spirit. To come across, we don't want to risk ourselves in honest speech. But I think the church desperately needs honest speech. But that's very dangerous, and it needs the pastor to work with it. But I don't think the average person would know love your neighbor means to correct. But then you have to put it together. You correct with love and gifts and kindness.
Love takes various forms, has various expressions.
But we need direction.
Right.
Because I don't think most of us without direction would know that.
I think about Leviticus 19. There's so much there that is an incarnation of that verse about loving. James in the New Testament actually picks up on Leviticus 19 and alludes to it extensively, including the parts about rebuke. So we have in James an example of what you just said, being holistic and not just pulling one verse out of context, but looking at it in its context to ask, what does love really look like?